Ray Taraborrelli, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, Josh. How you doing?
I am doing fantastic. You're my first three-peat. How about that?
It's pretty amazing. I mean, wow, so much time has passed and so much of everything is different. I
Mm,
mean, pretty much everything is different. It's not even a hyperbole, you know. Our lives have changed so much.
yeah. Yeah, it feels like it was a million years ago. Um, well, cool, man. Look, I know I got about an hour with you, and we'll just jump right into it. I wanted to ask you, Randy. Obviously, as you know, the great Mary Wilson recently passed. When we had spoken previously, I know you kind of got your start as a publicist for the Supremes, and of course, your first book was on Diana Ross. I think I'd like to start by asking you, Randy, if you had any thoughts or experiences or anything about Mary Wilson you'd like to share.
Um, wow, I met Mary when I was 10, so,
Hmm.
10 years old. It's hard to put into words because it's difficult and emotional, and I haven't talked about it at all on television. I decided not to.
Hmm.
I think that my work ethic as a kid came from two places. My father, who was self-employed, as I have always been. I've never had like a real job, and Mary, who was so influential uh, um, on me when I was a kid. She had so much influence on me because she was such a fighter. And when I graduated from high school, I didn't go to college,
Hmm.
as you know.
Right.
Um, Mary sent for me to come to California to work for the Supremes. I had been working for the Supremes running their fan club from the age of 10 till 18. Then when I got out of high school, I went to Los Angeles to be, sort of a junior publicist. I was still running the fan club, but I was like learning how to be a publicist at the same time.
Mm.
And so she gave me my start in show business, um, and I owe a lot to her. She taught me a lot, and the thing that really struck me about Mary was that in the last few years that I was working for her, Diana Ross was not in the group any longer, and so they were really struggling at Motown and having a lot of trouble.
Mm.
And and I so admired the way that she didn't give up. She never gave up. She was so determined to continue the Supremes and to claim the group's rightful place in history past Diana. I had so much admiration for that when I was a kid, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I look back on it now and I realize how much it taught me about persistence and tenacity in the face of great obstacles. Um, and um, and I remember that they had a record out which was called Bad Weather, and it was produced by Stevie Wonder.
Hmm.
And this was a really good record, and it came out and it did nothing, and Motown just didn't promote it. And when Stevie Wonder writes and produces a record for you and it's still not a hit because the record label has just abandoned you, that's a tough pill to swallow. And about 6 months after the record came out, Mary said to me, I think you need to get the fans to send postcards and call the radio stations, and that was my job, and get this record out there. We need to promote this record and get this record out there. It had been out for 6 months. If it wasn't a hit by that time, it wasn't going to be a hit,
Right.
right? And I told her, and I don't know what I was, maybe 15 or 16 years old, and I and I said to her, Mary, it's over, it's done. You know what? It's over. And I'll never forget it. She said to me, "It's not over until I say it's over." And I thought to myself, wow, that's how you take control. So, I mean, I have a million Mary Wilson stories, obviously. She's a big part of my life, a big part of my family's life. All my family knew her. My parents, my siblings, always went backstage to all their concerts from the time that I was a little kid until I left home. And so we have a lot of stories, and it's been an emotional time for me, but
Yeah.
I'm happy to just have the memories that I have of Mary. Um, she's going to be greatly missed by a lot of people.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. No, I appreciate sharing that, Randy. Right. Okay. So the book is Grace and Steel, Dorothy, Barbara, Laura, and the Women of the Bush Dynasty, on sale March 2nd, 2021. Unless you're a special like me and you get an advance copy, right?
Exactly.
Kirkus Review, I have the quote here, says, Taraborrelli gives the Bushes the royal treatment, making good use of ample research, including many interviews with those who worked in the households of the family. The author assembles a colorful mosaic of lives that didn't always fit comfortably together. A glossy dissection of the women members of a family that has loomed large over decades of U.S. politics. End quote. I think I want to start nice and easy, Randy, by asking you, what was it that guided you to want to write this book?
Well, I actually started a book about the Bush family maybe 7 years ago. I started doing interviews and, accumulating material and writing. And I just had a hard time with it. I couldn't break the story in a way that I felt like I was connecting to it. It felt like I was at an arm's length from it, and I didn't understand why. I have to say I wasn't a big fan of George W. Bush's when he was in office. I'm a much bigger fan of him now than I was then, but I wasn't, and a lot of it, and I think I brought a lot of that to that book at that time, and I might have even told you this story, Josh. I don't know, one of our other interviews, but I told my publisher, I said, I think I'm going to abandon this project. I think I want to do something else. And they were really stunned by that because in my entire career, I had never done anything like that. I've always seen everything through. And they said, wow, if you feel that strongly about it, then this book must not be for you. And I said, I think it's not. And so we abandoned it. I did something else. Actually, I did something that was like as far away from the Bush family as you could think of, and that was Beyonce. Right? It's like, okay, that's going from here all the way to here, right? And then that book came out, and then I did Jackie, Janet, and Lee, and when I was doing Jackie, Janet, and Lee, which is Janet Auchincloss and her daughters, Jackie and Lee, I realized that the thing that really interests me most are women's stories. And I've done a lot of women's stories in my career. I've done Grace Kelly, I've done Madonna, I've done Diana Ross. And I remembered that when I interviewed Barbara Bush like 20 some years ago. And in the interview with Barbara Bush, she was talking a lot about her mother-in-law, Dorothy Bush. And I remember during the course of that interview thinking to myself, wow, I wish she would stop talking about her mother-in-law because I'm not interested in her mother-in-law right now. I'm really interested in her. But she was talking about her. She was really intently talking about her. She loved her and she was so influential on her. And it stuck with me all those years. And I went back and pulled that interview and I listened to it and I thought to myself, wow, you know what? I think that this is the key to understanding the Bush family, is to understanding the mother-in-law and basically the matriarch of the family, Dorothy Bush. And I did some more research on Dorothy Bush and I realized that for 10 years, she wrote a political column 3 times a week for a newspaper. For 10 years, 3 times a week. And it was called My Life as a Senator's Wife. And so it was really sort of a diary of her experiences and sort of like an oral history 3 times a week for 10 years. That's a lot of column.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, wow, this is an opportunity to bring to life somebody like Janet Auchincloss, who is Jackie's mom, who no one had really ever heard of before my book about them. And I was able to sort of create a Janet Auchincloss character out of her oral histories at the Kennedy Library. And with the cooperation of Janet's son, Jamie Auchincloss, I was able to sort of put a character together that the public just didn't know anything about and introduce this character to the world in my own way, like in the way that I felt did her the best honor. And I thought this is a great opportunity to do the same thing for Dorothy Bush, who is George H.W. Bush's mother and George W. Bush's grandmother.
Hmm.
And and then that expanded into Barbara Bush and Laura Bush and all the other women of the Bush Dynasty. So to make a long story short and give you a very long answer to a good question, I just became inspired by Dorothy Bush to tell the story of all the women in the family.
Wow, that's great, Randy. Yeah, and obviously you kindly sent me the book. We've talked in the past about having the warts and all approach that you take to your books, not pulling any punches where you ought not to. One of the highlights of the book for me, Randy, has got to be the Bush Fitzgerald affair, which you delve into detail on. Excuse me. I wouldn't mind asking you, what was your research like? Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the first time that particular subject matter really gets touched in a book about the Bushes.
I talked to so many people about that relationship, and it was sort of an open secret, among the Bushes and the people who worked for the Bushes, that H.W. had this relationship with this woman that lasted for 13 years. And I had, I had a lot of trepidation about writing about it. But I thought that it was important because of not so much what it said about H.W. or what it said about the woman said about Barbara, and how she accepted it for such a long time. And I think that if you really look at Barbara Bush's public image, you would think that this is not something she would ever accept.
Sure.
Because Barbara Bush's public image was one of, she was so confident and she was sort of ballsy, and she spoke her mind.
Mm-hmm.
And there were elements of that were true, but a big part of that was her public image and not her private image. Privately, she was a very traditional wife of the 1950s. And she kept that sort of mentality, throughout much of her marriage to George Bush. And in fact, Dorothy Bush used to tell Barbara, you don't have to do everything that my son tells you to do. Dorothy Bush was a feminist long before the phrase was coined, as I wrote in the book. Dorothy was always on an equal footing with her husband Prescott, the senator, and she never acquiesced to him in any way in any way, pretty much ever, And she wanted that for Barbara. Sure. And Barbara just didn't see it that way. Barbara felt like, well, George makes all the decisions and George knows what's right, and that would have been fine with Dorothy, except for the fact that Barbara so much resented it. Like, if Barbara had been happy about it, if Barbara had been, a happy person who just went along with what her husband wanted her to do because that made her happy, that would have been fine with Dorothy Bush. But Barbara went along with George Bush on many major decisions over the years. He didn't even discuss with her when he was, when he wanted to run for president. He didn't discuss with her when he, being vice president. He didn't discuss anything with her. She didn't, but she also didn't demand that he do.
Sure.
And but she was unhappy about it, and she suffered from serious bouts of depression throughout her life. And Barbara, it was just a very complicated and I think sometimes really tortured person. She came from a family where her mother Pauline was very emotionally abusive, and those scars stuck with her for her entire life. And another reason why I wrote about the affair was because I just was fascinated by the way it ended. A 13-year relationship with a person, and it ended because they just decided not to call each other one day. It was like, I've had friendships that have ended that way, where you have a friendship that doesn't really serve you, that's a complicated, difficult relationship, and you talk to each other all the time, and then one day you just decide not to return that person's phone call, and then you never talk to that person again for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Has that ever happened to you or anything like that?
Funny you should ask. That actually happened to me very recently. A friend of mine, former friend of mine, he would call, he would text, and he's one of these political guys, right? Which is fine, but, it's... I'm a little bit over politics. I don't know about you, Randy. After this wretched year of 2020, and 2021 is not shaping up to be much better, right?
Right. Well, then you know what I mean. That it just ended in such a strange way, and I thought that was interesting. But beyond that, I thought what was even more interesting, and the reason that I really wanted to write about this, and if this hadn't happened, I don't think I would have written about it, because I don't think it would have any kind of value. But what I love is how Barbara and George came together and reinvented their relationship after that affair, and went on for another 25 years, very happy together. I mean, they were able to put that aside and continue with their lives and find value in the relationship, and George H.W. finding a new respect for his wife, and Barbara being able to forgive. I mean, I just thought all of that was sort of an object lesson as to how to go on with a marriage when the going gets tough, Yeah. And one thing you can say about the Bushes is that, as I said earlier about Mary Wilson, I mean, the Bushes are survivors. Mm-hmm. This is a family that does not give up. And I love that about them. And I don't always agree with their politics, but who cares? I am not a political writer. That's not what I do. I'm not, I don't do that.
Right.
There are great people who do. John Meacham
mm-hmm.
is he's my hero in that respect.
Arthur Schlesinger Jr.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's not what I do. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is write about family dynamics. I write about families, and if you'll notice in my books, the politics is always playing out in the background, and what's going on in the foreground are the family dynamics. Whereas in a political book, it's the other way around. John Meacham will write about the politics, and the underpinning the politics will be the family dynamic. I do just the opposite.
Right.
So, So go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, just sharpening your point. The politics, as you write, the politics is sort of the music that's playing in the background, but you're writing about the dancers.
That's it.
Trying to put an artistic spin on it, right?
Yeah, I like it. I don't want to think about George W. Bush dancing, but I do like it.
I like that. Well, and I don't want to get away from the book just yet, but I definitely want to ask about the historical perspective on the Bushes. George Bush Jr. fascinates me because there was a time where he was flat out called a war criminal. It sounds like it was forever ago, right? Feels like it was forever ago. But the historical perspective of him now, especially after a Trump presidency, right, is that he was a good guy who was doing his best. That seems that that's the way history's kind of, if you like, reimagined how we'll remember him. And I'm just curious how you think the Bushes will be remembered.
Well, you really nailed it, Josh. I was so not a fan of George W. Bush when he was in office, and the whole weapons of mass destruction just, tormented me and blew me away, as it did most people in this country. And there's not much you can say about that because they did not exist. And George has written about that in his book, Decision Points, and has expressed a lot of regret about that in very specific terms. I mean, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He says, they did not exist, and I'm very sorry about it. And there's not much more you can expect from a public servant than that.
Sure.
Well, what I found during the course of my research is that he is, fundamentally a very good man. And he's fundamentally a conscionable person, and somebody who I think deserves a lot of admiration for the way that he's lived his life. And when you read the book, you kind of fall in love with him. You know, you kind of do. I mean, I love his relationship with Laura Bush. I love their bond. I love what they have and what they always had. And the photographs in the book of them as a young couple, you know, right when they got married. Mm-hmm. And you look at the two of them together, you think to yourself, oh my God, you know, they were born to be together. And I love the stories that I told about Laura's struggle with infertility and how, you know, I interviewed a nurse who told me that she witnessed a conversation, you know, where George said to Laura, you know, if we never have children, you're enough for me. You are enough for me. You know, and I'm writing these stories, and I'm like, you know, I'm kind of loving George Bush right now, you know, and I think that and I think that that's a real lesson for us. You know, look, I interviewed Donald Trump 4 times, as you know, in my life and times.
Yes.
And every time I interviewed Donald Trump, I had more admiration for him than the last time I interviewed him. Donald Trump, I felt at the time was a good man, you know. And then Donald Trump became president, and I don't know what happened to him. In my own personal opinion, he went down a different road.
Sure.
And was no longer the person that I felt that I had known. But that said, I still think that down in there with the passing of time, when someone like me comes along in 20 years and writes about Donald Trump, I think that they're going to unearth the organic Donald Trump that I met years ago, and they're going to have the same relationship with him that I had with George W. Bush, which was, you know, finding the real person underneath the so-called war criminal, you know, and realizing that politics warps everything, and it warps people. And I don't know that it's fair always to judge a person by their politics, because I've done a lot of books about people, and I found that often what people profess to be true of their politics isn't really how they feel. It's more their platform than it is their real life. And I think that I learned a lot about H.W. Bush and W. and Jeb in this book, because and Prescott too, because of my sort of entry into the book through their wives.
Right.
And you see a different side of them when you're looking at them through the lens of their marriages.
Yeah. No, absolutely, Randy. I appreciate it. Bring it back to Barbara then for a minute, Randy. I'm actually really excited. The book delves into her relationship with Nancy Reagan, right? And I think I just want to ask you, what was it that made you think to include that in the book? Because that, I believe, is the first time that subject matter has been touched.
You know, I don't do anything. I don't do anything, you know, for just sort of titillation value when I write. I don't do anything just because.
Catch penny.
Like I pick and choose my stories. I don't tell every story that there is, because you can't possibly do that in a book. I decide which stories I think tell the most about the character. And the reason that I wrote about the sort of contentious relationship that those two women had was because of what it said about Barbara, not Nancy. Nancy's not my subject. It wasn't about Nancy. It was about Barbara, and it was about the fact that Nancy Reagan reminded Barbara Bush of her mother. It's so interesting to me that Nancy Reagan reminded Barbara Bush of her critical mother, Pauline. And if you look at the pictures of Pauline in the book, you kind of see a little Nancy Reagan in there. And Nancy was very critical of the Bushes. I mean, she dismissively called them the shrubs. Right. You know, she felt that Barbara should have dyed her hair, and she didn't like the way that Barbara comported herself, and she didn't like Barbara's fashion choices, and she was very, very critical of Barbara to people in the White House. And she was saying about Barbara the same things that Barbara's mother used to say about her. And it really hit Barbara in a, you know, it triggered her in a deep place.
Mm-hmm.
And their relationship was not good. I'd like to take credit for that being for this being the first time that this has been delved into, but it's not really true, because George H.W. Bush wrote about this in his autobiography, and he duplicated passages in his diary in that book in which he said, I think that Nancy Reagan is jealous of my Barbara, because Barbara is everything that Nancy wishes that she were.
Sure.
Barbara is organic. Barbara, speaks her mind. And then I read that and I was like, well, that's the public image of Barbara Bush, and not necessarily the way Barbara was in her marriage to H.W.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly it was the way we thought of Barbara, but it wasn't really the truth of Barbara. And then when I read those passages, I was thinking to myself, wow, this is out of this man's diary. It's like even he doesn't really at this moment when he's writing this understand his wife, that she is much more complicated than even H.W. understood when he was writing that Nancy is probably jealous of Barbara. That said, I think she probably was anyway.
Right on, man. Let me see. Obviously, and this is covered in some detail in the book as well, the Bush women, they all came together back in 2016 with that punch out between Jeb Bush and Donald Trump, right? I'd love if I can prompt you for a little teaser on why Barbara didn't think Jeb Bush should have ran to begin with.
It's interesting, and she said it publicly. I think that there have been enough Bushes. That's what she said. But I really think that what it came down to, look, she loved Jeb. They all thought Jeb was going to be the one. They were really surprised that W turned out to be the one. They always thought W was just going to be, he was like this sort of good old boy, who was, they
baseball manager.
They didn't take him as seriously as maybe they should have. They really thought Jeb was going to be the president, not W. And but that didn't happen. And then when it was time, when it might have been Jeb's time, Barbara felt like Jeb might have to pay the price for weapons of mass destruction. Like, why should Jeb have to bear the consequences of his brother's presidency, was really where Barbara was coming from. When she said, we've already had enough Bushes, we really didn't have that many. We only had two. Mm-hmm. Not counting Prescott. And Prescott was a senator back in the 50s. So
sure.
Most people don't know that. It wasn't like we had a lot of Bushes. Jeb was governor and W had been governor, but in terms of the presidency, we had two. We probably could have had three. We would have been okay with that. A lot of people would have been fine with that. I think that Barbara was being very protective of Jeb. And then I think Donald Trump came into their orbit, and then she realized, wow, do we really need this in our family? How is this serving us? This political landscape. Mm-hmm. Where everything is very different. I mean, Donald Trump was not your Bush Republican. He was a whole different breed of Republican, and Jeb was sort of more old school Republican. And I think that she just didn't want the family to be a part of it anymore.
Yeah, understandable. Bring it back a little bit, Randy. I know we talked about it sort of briefly. I'd like to talk about a little bit more. Obviously, this is your first book on the Bushes. I know you've written generously, obviously, about the Kennedy family we've talked about. I think you've written 4 books on them, including Jackie, Ethel, and Joan, Women of Camelot, back in 2000, 21 years ago, if you can believe it. I am curious to dig a little bit deeper. What is it exactly about the women in these families that prompt you to want to write about them?
I'm always fascinated by powerful women who stand their ground.
Mm,
You know, I'm I'm interested in formidable characters, and and in the cases of the Bushes and the Kennedys, the legend looms so large. The Kennedy legend looms so large, for instance, with JFK and Bobby and Ted and all of the Kennedy-ness of the Kennedys, that the women just sort of got lost in all of that, in terms of the historical record,
mm.
but not in terms of what was actually going on personally. And I thought when I wrote Jackie, Ethel, and Joan, it was the first time that anybody had ever written about the women who married into the family. And I was like, how is it possible that that has not happened yet? When I wrote that book 21 years ago, and I thought, it's just so indicative of the way that history has sort of obscured the roles of women in powerful historical families, that no one has thought to write about the women who married into the Kennedy family before me.
Sure.
And this was in the year 2000. Certainly there had been plenty of time prior to 2000 for somebody to do it, going back 40 years, right?
Right, right.
And it hadn't been done. And the same holds true with Dorothy, Barbara, and Laura. I mean, I really think that this is really the first time that these three women have been analyzed in relation to, their relationship to each other. People have written about Barbara. People have written about Laura. I don't think anybody's written about Dorothy.
Right.
And I don't think anybody's written about their trafficking in the world together. So to answer your question, I like writing news stories. I like writing stories that people don't know. And I also like writing about powerful women. And if I can find a way to intersect all of that, then that's gold for me.
Sure. Absolutely, man. Um, the, I'm trying to think of a way to ask you this question without stroking your ego too much, right? But why not, right? So you've written, I think, 21, 22 books at this point, and the great majority of them have been bestsellers. I think across 21 books, I think you got 15 in the bag as far as New York Times bestsellers, which is a pretty incredible win-loss ratio, right? I'm curious what you think the common value or the through line is in your bibliography that leads them to become so successful. Because you were pretty much a successful author from your very first book, right? Your book on Diana Ross. I've always, across 3 interviews now, I've always wanted to ask you that.
I think that I mean, well, I have a couple of sort of mandates when I write a book. I want my reader to not regret the time spent reading it. That's number one. Like, you've noticed, my books are really thick, and they demand a great investment of time. And I've wanted very seriously for my reader to not finish it and think, wow, why did I ever read this book? So that's number one. And the way that I feel that I can go about that is to have my reader fall in love with the subjects by the time they finish the book. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to dislike that person during the course of the life and times that are being told in the book. That doesn't mean that you're not going to disagree with that person. That doesn't mean that you're not going to wish that person had done something differently or said something differently. But it means that you're going to understand the humanity of that person and understand that in the course of our lifetimes we make mistakes. And those mistakes are going to be found in the book. But if you're a good person, you try hard, to be a good person in your life. And I only write about people that I really admire. And so it's easy for me to make sure that my reader falls in love with that person. And I think that when you read Grace and Steel, I think that you fall in love with those women. I don't think that you leave that book with a single sort of negative thought about any of them. I really don't think you do. I mean, I think I think that you leave it wanting more of them, not less.
Sure.
Right. And so I think that's what my books have in common is my intention is always to make sure that they are written about in such a respectful manner that you admire and even love the subjects by the time you finish the book. And I think that has worked with my readers, and I think that that's why they continue to go back to my books.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I remember in our first interview a couple years back, I remember you saying that if the book doesn't keep you up at night while you're writing it, it's not going to keep anyone else up while they're reading it.
That sounds like me, yeah.
Let me see. I'd like to actually dial the clock back a little bit, Randy. Book I've always wanted to ask you about. 1997, you wrote a book on Frank Sinatra, which I believe was called Sinatra Behind the Legend. What led to Sinatra as a subject?
It's funny you ask about that because we're doing that book right now as a series.
Huh.
And it hasn't been announced yet, so I can't tell you who it's for. But we're in it right now. We're scripting it.
Awesome.
The reason I did Sinatra was because he was always such a hero in my family. Like in most Italian American families, your grandparents had 3 pictures framed in the kitchen. Whoever the present Pope was, Jesus Christ, and Frank Sinatra. and I loved Sinatra, and I just felt like he was somebody that had not been treated fairly. I felt in previous books about him, and I felt like I sort of being Italian American and being raised that way and being raised around Italian Americans and. My grandfather was a member of the Sons of Italy, and when I was a little kid, my grandfather took me to a Sons of Italy meeting, which was fantastic. I mean, I just felt like I could understand Sinatra better than most people, and that's why I wrote about him. And I really love that book, and I rewrote that book about 5 years ago. I took the 1997 edition and wrote it again. I went back and rewrote every single page of that book.
God.
Because, yeah, wasn't my intention. My intention was just to sort of update it. But as I was reading it, I was like, no, I don't feel this way anymore. I mean, the thing that I think people don't get about guys like me who are writers for the long haul, who are in it for decades, is that you don't feel the same way today that you felt when you were 30.
Sure.
Like you don't feel when you're 45 the way you felt when you were 23. And when these books are published and they're still out there and people go back and they read them, they think, wow, this guy, they might have an opinion about you as the writer because you bring so much to the book. They might have an opinion about you that is no longer true. That you change. I mean, hopefully we're not the same people that we were 20 years ago. Hopefully we're not going to be the same people in 20 years that we are today.
Right.
Hopefully we change. And a writer brings all of that to his work. I think that when you read one of my books, you're reading as much about me as you are about the subject. You're able to tell a lot about the writer of a book by the stories that he chooses to tell and by the way that he tells them and by the way that he frames them, And so I rewrote the Sinatra book because I wanted it to reflect my present sensibility. And that was about 5 years ago. And who knows, in another 5 years, I might feel differently about all of it and have to do it again.
Yeah.
But the present edition of Sinatra Behind the Legend that's out is the rewritten edition. And I really love it. I'm glad you asked about it. It was a New York Times bestseller again. And I think it's a good book.
That's awesome, man. No, good stuff. Obviously we've talked about how, I myself am a writer and I have my own inspirations. George Orwell is one of them, right? The lucidity of his prose and the way he was able to pick something up and just show it to you and wouldn't wouldn't stray from it. And it's amazing that I've never asked you this before, Randy, but I'm just curious, any writers, authors, biographers that inspire you?
Not as many as you would think. Like we mentioned John Meacham earlier, who is somebody that really inspires me to reach higher when I'm writing about a person, and definitely inspired me where the Bushes are concerned, because his book on HW is such a great book and shows you how it should be done. I'll tell you the truth, Josh, and I don't say this too often, but I'll say it to you. I don't have enough time to read. I don't have time, man. I mean, I haven't had a break since 1975. So, I mean, I have been writing since I was a little kid, and I have always had a deadline. I've always been a writer. I've always had a book that I'm working on. I'm working on the Obamas right now. I am always working, and the unfortunate part of that as a writer is that when I read, it's for work.
Sure.
All I do all day long is homework. I'm reading, I'm writing, I'm reading, I'm writing. And so in my spare time, the last thing that I really feel like I want to do is read. And it's a shame, because that's why I became a writer. I became a writer because I love to read and I love books. But as an adult, I found that if you're immersed in reading and writing for 10 to 15, in your off time, the last thing you want to do is read.
Sure.
And it's a shame, but I don't do as much reading as I wish I did.
Yeah, damn.
For that very reason.
Sure. And then what's the experience like having a book become a New York Times bestseller? I was thinking about this, how to phrase this to you, Randy, earlier this week. Take the Diana Ross book, salient because it was the first book that you wrote. How does that work? Is it that your agent calls you and says, "Hey, Randy, we got some great news, break out the bubbly," or how does it go where it's communicated to you that it was a New York Times bestseller?
That's how it goes. The way you just described it is usually it's your editor or your publisher who calls you and says, congratulations, and you kind of wait for that call.
Sure.
And you kind of know around the time that your book is going to hit the list, and you're kind of waiting for that call. And if anybody tells you that doesn't matter to them, or they're not waiting for the call, I think they're probably lying to you, because about the week it's going to hit, and you wait for the call. And if the call doesn't come, it's kind of crushing. They don't call you to tell you didn't make the list. They only call you when you make it. So if the phone doesn't ring that week, then you kind of know you didn't make it.
Sure.
Right? Look, I've had 16 New York Times bestsellers. I think I've had my share of New York Times bestsellers, and I'm very, very grateful, to my readers for that. And I just, I think it's an honor for somebody to spend their time. We're so busy, that for somebody to spend their time reading a book that I wrote, I don't take it for granted at all, and if it translates into being a New York Times bestseller, that's something that I think any writer should be really grateful for, and should not take it for granted, and should just, every time it happens for me, I'm just like, wow, that's amazing that, that the book matters to people, because it matters to me so much, Josh, when I'm writing it. I don't think people can really understand, unless you're another writer, how much time you spend at night in bed with staring at the ceiling thinking, is this fair? This bothers me. Like, that word, is that word right? Is that pejorative?
Right.
Is that insulting? Or is that too much? I mean, like, am I falling in love a little bit too much with George W. Bush here? Is it too much? Is it not enough? There's a lot of weighing that goes on in your mind about language and about the way that you're presenting people, about the obligation that you have to history. Is that true, or did I get that wrong? And you wake up in the middle of the night and you go down and you take a look at it on your computer, and you fine tune it and you change a word, and then you go back to bed, and then you're like, I don't know about that word. What I'm saying is that I put a lot into it. So when it's successful, it really means a lot because I've invested so much. And you're told as a young writer to not care what people think. You're told you got to write for yourself. Mostly you're told it doesn't make any difference what people think. You're doing it for yourself. Man, that's fine if you're like the kind of guy who, and I've always wanted to be this guy. You go down the beach with your steno pad and the sun's going down and you're in your chair with your Mai Tai and you're just writing your thoughts and no one's ever going to see them. And it's just, you're just waxing rhapsodic about all kinds of things. And that's very fulfilling if that's who you are. But if you're writing for people to read it, then you're writing for them as much as you're writing for yourself. It's a marriage, and you're in it with your audience, with your readers, and you have a responsibility to your readers for it to be accurate, and for it to be fair, and for it to be a respectful portrait. That's your responsibility to them. So you're not writing just for yourself, you're writing for them. And when they then embrace it, then you know that you've done your job, and it's very, very fulfilling. So I always tell young people who ask me, about the relationship that you have with your readers, I'd always tell them you really have to nurture it, and you have to make sure you don't lose their respect, and you have to make sure that you don't lose their faith. Mm-hmm. The faith of your readers is everything.
Absolutely. No, thanks, Randy. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking, going back to the warts and all thing that we keep talking about. I remember you told me in our first interview that you had that discussion with Michael Jackson regarding your biography, where he was upset with you about including all the bits about plastic surgery in the book. And you basically had to have the discussion, right, that, man, it wouldn't work. It doesn't, the audience will sense the bullshit, right? Surely. So
well, that's why I like doing interviews with you, because we've done so many.
Yeah.
And you know everything there is to know already. Like when I talk to you, there's like I'm talking to a person who has, like, most people on the planet could not refer to something I said about Michael Jackson, 5 years ago. Oh. It's like you could just kind of call it up, and every time you tell me something, like, I don't remember saying that to you because I do hundreds of interviews a year, but every time you bring up something that I said to you, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like me. And Michael and I had a lot of discussions about that because when you're personal friends with a public figure and you're in the media and that person is a celebrity who has a tortured relationship with the media, then you often end up, loggerheads with each other about the way that you're doing your job, And so, yeah, we had a lot of conversations about that when I was younger.
Sure. Let me see. Dude, I got one more book to ask you about, and then I will have asked you about every single book you've written. How about that?
Wow, that's amazing.
Right? Yeah, so... what guided you to want to write about Madonna?
Madonna is an interesting story because I started Madonna back in the 1990s when she was going through this phase in her life where she was very self-involved, and it was all about, it was a very sort of sexual renegade phase. where she was promoting, S&M in her music, and she had a sex book out where she was naked in a lot of it, and this was just, and she was just sort of this very sort of self-involved person, and I couldn't, and I had interviewed her many times, and I was young and dumb, and if you've been around long enough, you can look back and realize how young and dumb you are at certain times in your life. And I wrote in an article that she's everything that you think she is and less, right? She was so mad at me. Oh my God. We had a falling out that lasted for years, and I put the book aside at that point, and I thought, I think that I'm not ready to write about her yet. I think she needs an arc. Like, she needs to go from here to here, and I was catching her here in the middle.
Sure.
And I put it aside for a few years, and then during that period of time, she got married, she had children, she discovered Kabbalah, she became philanthropic. She became a real person, and not just a celebrity. And that's when I picked up the book again, and I had done a few interviews with her in the interim, and I realized that, finally, she was everything that you think she is and more. And that's when I felt like she deserved the full sort of JRT royal treatment. And that's the book that ultimately came out. And then since that time, I've done what I did with Sinatra. Since that original book, I went back and rewrote the whole doggone thing. And that revision book came out a couple years ago.
2018.
2018, yeah. And that's sort of the way I feel about her today. I still feel the same way about her, 3 or 4 years later. I haven't changed that much yet.
Sure.
We'll see how I feel in 10 years. I think she's amazing. I mean, I think if you read that book, I think that you come away with a whole new admiration for her. And so I'm glad you asked about it, because I love that book.
Cool. Awesome, man. Thank you. I just got 2 questions left, my friend, and then you're no longer my prisoner. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Over the years that I've gotten to know you, I've become more and more appreciative of just the caliber of people that you've interviewed, not just for your books, but in your career as a journalist. You've interviewed, I'm in Minnesota. I know you've interviewed Prince a couple times, Michael Jackson, obviously. And I think I want to ask you if there's a particular interview that stands out for you, one where you just were truly starstruck. I've always wanted to ask you that.
Wow, Josh, so many. I mean, I think that one woman who really starstruck me, and it wasn't even an interview, it was a meeting. The first time that I met Jacqueline Onassis was such a moment for me. It wasn't an interview. We were talking about the book that she wanted me to write for Doubleday about Diana Ross.
Mm-hmm.
And I may have told you this before, but I went into that meeting prepared to ask her a lot of questions about the Kennedys. And I thought, this is my one and only chance. This is a woman. Oh, I wrote about this in After Camelot, actually. I knew this sounded familiar because I wrote about this. This was my one opportunity, because she is a first-hand witness to so much history, and she never did interviews, ever. So I felt like, I'm going to be with Jacqueline Onassis. I'm doggone, I'm going to ask her everything I want to ask her. This is my chance. Well, come to find out, Jackie had a secret weapon that I didn't know about. And the secret weapon was accessibility, total vulnerability and trust. That when she sat down with you, she was so open and trusting of the relationship that you were establishing in that moment, that there was no way on God's green earth that you were ever going to return her to any sadness in her life. She trusted you that you weren't going to do this. and you did not want to let her down. And I've never met anybody like that before. That I've never met anybody whose openness and vulnerability and embrace of you was so total that you would never ask her a question that would make her unhappy or upset, because you couldn't bear to be that guy, right? And Michael Jackson was getting ready to work with Jackie on his autobiography. She was going to be his editor. And Michael called me up before his meeting with Jackie, which was at their home in Encino. And Michael said, dude, I'm going to ask her all the questions that I always wanted to ask her. Michael, I can't wait to talk to her. It's going to be great. I'm going to ask her all the questions, right? And I said to him, Mike, you're not going to ask her any of those questions. I promise you, dude, none of those questions will be asked. And he said, no, I really think I'm going to. And I was like, okay, let's talk after. And she went and they met at his home, and he called me up and he was like, I couldn't ask her any of those questions. And Michael had the same experience that I had with her, which was, I think that to answer your question, that's kind of being starstruck, but it's also beyond being starstruck. It's really being respectful of the rapport that you're establishing with an icon who is letting you in and trusting that she's not going to regret it, right? And that to me is my biggest starstruck story.
Fantastic. That's awesome, Randy. Well, all right, my friend. Yeah, so once again, the book is Grace and Steel, Dorothy, Barbara, Laura, and the Women of the Bush Dynasty, available March 2nd, 2021. Jenna and Taraborrelli, how can people find out about you, sir?
You can go to my website, jrandytaraborrelli.com. You can go to Amazon. I have an Amazon page. I have a YouTube page. I have 2 Facebook pages. I have Twitter, Instagram, and I'm all over the place. So, just, check me out on the internet. Thanks, man. That this is the first interview I'm doing for Grace and Steel. You're the very, very first one that I've talked to about this book. So I just want you to know that I really appreciate the fact that you're always there for me, Josh. And I always like giving you the first interview because you ask good questions, and it's sort of a great way for me to practice my answers, And so I really appreciate it, man, and thank you so much.
Yeah, dude, no, you're welcome. It's always a pleasure to see you. Hopefully, if you're ever in Minnesota or I'm out in LA town, we can grab a beer. How's that sound?
Sounds good, buddy. I look forward to that, man.
All right, Randy. You take care, my friend.
You too.
All right.